Good evening. Today we'll talk about The Wind Rises. The non-edited version was aired the other day. I was very surprised when I looked at all the tweets after the broadcast. There were so many people who were moved by it, or who couldn't stop crying at the last scene. What was more surprising was that there were more people moved by it than by the first broadcast. Back in 2015 or in 2013, when the film was released, people are more willing now to accept the film as it is. Back in 2013, a lot of Ghibli fans who went into the movie expecting a stereotypical heartwarming Hayao Miyazaki animation were disappointed and let down by the unexpected twist in the story. But this time, since they had a long break from Ghibli films, people were more open. They had been watching other animations and films. They developed more flexibility in interpreting films, which was good. This lecture is a complete commentary on The Wind Rises. It might be a bit disturbing for those of you who thought, "Oh, it was a lovely film. I was so moved. I'd love to be in that kind of romantic relationship." This lecture might be disheartening. But you must understand that Hayao Miyazaki intended this to be his last film ever, and he had nothing to lose. Therefore, I'd like you to tackle the film head on. Some parts overlap with my previous lecture on Nico Nico Live, but I've made new discoveries since, and I feel that I didn't dig deep enough then. So this is the complete commentary on The Wind Rises. I'd like to go step by step, looking at each frame like we do in the Gundam lecture. You'll see how I watch animations, and we'll do it by looking at each frame. You can experience it for yourself, how I watch animations. Now, we'll move on to commentary number 1. I just said that very explicitly. This means that this is the editing point. Now, yeah. Thank you. Commentary number 1. You see the title here, The Wind Rises. The Wind Rises is, needless to say, an excerpt from Paul Valéry's poem. Paul Valéry's poem. The wind is rising. We must try to live. If you see down here, Miyazaki intentionally uses the translation of the novelist Tatsuo Hori instead of the original text. This quote, "The wind is rising, we must try to live," is introduced in the prelude of his novel with the same title, The Wind Rises. It's a long paragraph, so I made it a lot shorter. This first part means, the wind has risen, but we must go on living. It goes, the wind arose, and the easel with my unfinished painting collapsed. I said, "Please, please don't go," and clung on to you. And you let me have my way. Just then, the words, "The wind is rising, we must try to live," came out of my mouth. So everything starts from here, and needless to say, this prelude provides the structure for the film, The Wind Rises. In Tatsuo Hori's novel, the easel collapsing is a sign that his lover is going to die. The protagonist is basically saying, "Please don't leave me." He pulls the woman by the arms, and the woman surrenders and lets him do as he wants. At that very moment, the words, "I must go on living," slip out of his mouth. That is roughly the story. You see, once you understand the meaning of it, you can tell that the scene where Nahoko's Iso collapses in the wind at a plateau in Karuizawa is the portent of the death of Nahoko. Miyazaki made this clear in the scene, but to understand the scene, we have to interpret the poem properly. He assumed that some of you would pick this up in the first few seconds of the film. If he just wanted to quote Paul Valéry's poem, he would simply have said, written by Paul Valéry, but he intentionally added translation by Tatsuo Hori. That's because Miyazaki wanted to tell the audience that Hori's novel is the basis for the film. Well, yes, but how would you know? Of course, it's hard to know as usual. Anyway, there's this book called The Sequel, Where the Wind Returns. On page 234, Miyazaki starts to speak his own mind. People who don't understand anything. They are uneducated. They don't have any sense of history whatsoever. They know nothing. Sheer ignorance, unprepared and uneducated. It's hard to even imagine. I'm pretty sure I worked harder when I was young. But then he rethinks that statement and concludes, but I guess I didn't study all that hard. Takahata was the only one that studied. So there's a weird punchline. Yes. Miyazaki is an outright left-wing progressive. He expects people to know these things. When he's interviewed, he often says, everybody's so uneducated. They should all go to hell. But then he says, but when I think about it, Takahata used to say the same thing to me. So it's all pretty harmless. So this excerpt from the novel is a metaphor. Of course, you don't have to know all these things in order to enjoy the film. But since Miyazaki is quite clearly indicating that his audience should have a certain minimum level of education, we should, at the very least, do a little bit of work and attempt to view the story from his vantage point. You'll discover so many things once you make an effort. Just a little adjustment. When you look at the film bit by bit, one frame at a time, you'll discover so many things, and it's just so much more interesting. Now let's go to the first scene. This is it. Miyazaki uses 35 seconds just for the title and Valéry's poem. He takes his time, and after a whole minute, we finally begin to see an old house in the morning mist. Inside the sliding doors, we see Jiro, the protagonist, sleeping. And this takes another 30 seconds, which is also a long time for one scene. The morning mist flows over a rice paddy, and it's very beautiful. This is a lost landscape, one we don't see anymore. The typical Japanese landscape of rice paddies has mostly disappeared. He shows all these sites that would eventually vanish. He shows things that have now been lost. The most striking image is this rice paddy in the countryside. The middle frame is the open sliding doors. Here in the storyboard, he uses the term sohoka. Sohoka is basically a family that is not of high social class, but is nonetheless wealthy. Not an official or the head of a village, or a lawmaker or a lawyer or a doctor, but an old rich family living in the countryside. Miyazaki specifically tells the animator that this is a wealthy old family. Jiro Horikoshi is 13 years of age. Miyazaki devotes 10 seconds to the rice paddy, 5 seconds to the sliding doors, 25 seconds to the sleeping Jiro, so it's very slow. It is set in 1916, in the Taisho era, 3 years before the Great Depression and during World War I. The open sliding doors indicate that the servant is already awake. We tend to look at Jiro, but we have to realize in the second frame that the sliding doors are open and the servant is already awake. The servant wakes up way before the kids and opens the shutters one after another. I told you about the things we've lost. Well, this is one of them. And not just the rice paddy, but the whole class system that was vital to farming. Some people were born into families with high status. Jiro's family didn't have high social status, but they were wealthy. Poor people were sold to wealthy families to work as servants. They had to get up very early in the morning and open the shutters while the children were still asleep. This class system is one of the things that Miyazaki shows as having been lost, irreplaceable, beautiful things. Usually, class systems are considered unjust and are depicted in a negative light. But in this film, Miyazaki includes the class system among those beautiful things. We'll talk about this class system in detail this week and next week. Jiro climbs up on his roof in his dream. This may be too small to see, but he is walking on the roof. Take a look at how he walks. Oops, this is upside down. Sorry. For those of you who recorded the film, I want you to take a look at this scene again. He first puts his right foot forward and then his left foot. But can you see how his foot is turned in? Can you zoom in on my hand, please? He's not walking straight. His leg is turned in on his second step. This makes him look very unstable. Miyazaki intentionally made him walk like this to show that he's walking on a roof. This type of realism can only be seen in Miyazaki's animations or in Ghibli animations. Usually when people praise the drawing skills or the acting of the characters in animations, they're talking about how well they are drawn. But Ghibli characters are believable and real, and this is something you don't see in any other animations. So if you recorded this, make sure you watch it again. And then you see his handmade bird-shaped plane. And when Jiro gets in, he places both his hands on the frame of the plane. And then carefully lowers his body in like this. This is also something you should check. Jiro gets on his plane, his dream plane, and turns on the switch. This gray switch here. This gray part is made of bakelite, which was still rare back then. Bakelite was a material used for black phones in the Showa era. It's similar to plastic, but it's very malleable and insulin. So it was often used for electronic products. This was back in 1916, before the Showa era. So you can see that this boy was quite the studious. He knew a lot about science. This bakelite shows that. The propellers start to rotate when he turns on the switch. And strangely, the plane rises a bit for a second. When Miyazaki was interviewed by an airplane model magazine, he was asked, "Is that a catapult? Is that a catapult to launch aircrafts?" And he says, "No, it's not. The aircraft just floats." Of course, it's scientifically incorrect, but that's because back in that period, people knew about airplanes and had actually seen them flying, but most of them had never seen a plane actually take off. You have to go to an airfield to see that. Most people had only seen aircraft in the air and they thought that they floated. Miyazaki says that only the people who lived near an airfield knew that the planes had to taxi before they took off, and that the planes had to continue running even after landing. The reason why Miyazaki included this scene is because it is linked to the title, The Wind Rises. The plane needs wind blowing against it in order to fly. Wind in this story is a metaphor for adversity. Pain and struggle in this story are always depicted as wind. The Great Kanto earthquake, fires, the Sino-Japanese War, the death of his beloved, Nahoko. All these tragedies that happen in Japan, or to Jiro himself, are represented by the wind, the strong wind blowing against him. Planes create strong headwinds by taxiing before they take off. The wings can only develop the lifting power to fly by fighting the wind that blows against them. That's the meaning of this title. But 13-year-old Jiro doesn't know that yet, that you need headwind in order to fly a plane. He thinks that the plane automatically floats in the air. He is still young in this scene, so he has not yet experienced any adversity and doesn't know the meaning of it. He must understand that in order to fly his own plane, he needs the wind that fights against him. In order to make this ideal, beautiful plane that he has in mind, he must experience a strong headwind that will blow everything precious away from him. This is the meaning of The Wind Rises. No matter how strong the wind, he carries on. Otherwise, he couldn't have made such a beautiful plane. This is a sign that Miyazaki is using this metaphor as the basis of his story. That's why he shows this innocent, young Jiro in the beginning. But Jiro gradually begins to understand the meaning of the wind and tries to create his own plane. So that's what this film is all about. Are you all with me? We've still only covered the first 2 minutes of the film. Are you all with me? Okay, let's move on. Commentary number 2. This is only the first 2 minutes. Now the 13-year-old Jiro is still sound asleep. Our protagonist is still in his dream. Jiro's bird-shaped plane lifts off from the roof and rises to a level where he can see the rice paddies around him. And the land is lit by sunlight. It's a beautiful scene. The rising sun turns golden and the rice paddies are flooded with light. Such a dynamic scene. This is the main highlight of the opening. Even the sound is great. You hear a roaring sound and the music changes its tone. You see a lot of beautiful sunrise scenes in Miyazaki's films. The most famous one is probably in the Laputa Castle in the Sky. The morning after Shita spends the night in Pazu's house, the sun rises as Pazu plays a tune on his trumpet on the roof. The light pours into the valley and turns golden. Miyazaki depicts the sunlight in an indirect way. He shows the birds flying and shows the beauty all around it. He even includes Shita's voice saying, "Wow!" As a matter of fact, Miyazaki and Isao Takahata used the same trick more than 10 years ago when they made Heidi, Girl of the Alps. This is the 3rd episode. These are the Alps lit by the sunset, and the mountains are reflecting the golden color. Heidi and Peter are enjoying the spectacular view, and as the sun sinks lower, the mountains become rose-colored. Heidi shouts, "Look at that! It's rose pink!" But the mountains go back to brown within seconds. Heidi is so excited by this brief phenomenon. Peter sees this view every day, but it was new to Heidi. The mountains turning gold, rose pink, and then back to brown. It's quite difficult to show the actual beauty of the scenery in a drawing, so the creative team used Heidi's reaction. They made Heidi say, "The mountains are golden and they are burning pink," in order to indirectly express the beauty of the scenery. Heidi, Girl of the Alps, was made in 1974. Laputa was made in 1986. By then, they were able to depict beauty more directly. By 2013, they had finally succeeded in depicting scenic beauty on screen. The sun shining in from the side of the scene, the rice paddies reflecting the sunlight. 40 years after Heidi, Girl of the Alps, they finally succeeded in depicting the natural beauty of a landscape. After all that work, they finally reached their goal. They were very tenacious. It's impressive. Afterwards, this plane loses altitude and flies low over the rice paddies. Miyazaki inserts this scene in order to create a link to the Zero fighter plane scene at the end of the film. Jiro Horikoshi's dream of flying low over the fields on a beautiful plane is later realized by the pilots of the Zero fighter planes. There's a scene at the end of the film where Zero fighter planes fly low and fast over the fields like dragonflies. However, those pilots never come back. Jiro couldn't become a pilot after all, but that's why he survived. He didn't die because he couldn't become a pilot. So this first scene is here to enhance the significance of the last scene with the Zero fighter planes. After this scene, the villagers don't notice Jiro flying low over the ground. Nobody can see him. Even when he's flying under the bridge, the boatmen don't notice. But the girls working at the spinning mill notice him. This is intentional. Only the pretty girls in the factory notice him flying, but none of the guys in the scene notice him. And the girls even wave at him. Jiro waves back at them, but at this point, he's no longer the 13-year-old Jiro. If you look at him waving, he's already grown up and very good looking. Later, when his plane collides with the airship, he goes back to his 13-year-old self. But in his imagination, he's tall and good looking and not wearing glasses. That's an interesting point in these scenes. He's just 13 years old, so it's understandable. This is the dream of a young boy. Now, why did Miyazaki create this scene? Why did he only make the girls notice Jiro and not the guys? Why did he try to show that Jiro loves girls who treat him like superstars? Why did he try to show the embarrassing, or should I say, bad side of the protagonist? Prior to this film, Miyazaki had never done this before. He did it in comedy films like Lupin III and in Porco Rosso. He does that with comic characters, but not with a serious character like Jiro. He never pokes fun at his characters. That's because, of course, he's competing with Takahata. Takahata has argued through the years in his works like Grave of the Fireflies, Pompoko, The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, that overly subjective stories are bad fantasy. He hates animations that are too emotional. He has repeatedly said that you always need a certain level of objectivity towards the protagonist. So Miyazaki does the complete opposite. He totally immerses himself in the character. TV dramas are always like that. All moving animations and films are like that. J-pop is like that. The artists try to express how sad, how painful, how happy the protagonist is. They do whatever they can to invoke empathy. Takahata, on the other hand, says that we're surrounded by this type of work. It's like a drug. So he completely denounces it and says, we must create films that make people think. Miyazaki was probably irked by this, but was probably also half convinced by Takahata's comments. But this was his last animation, and he finally gave in. He finally did it, but it looks a bit awkward. It seems unnatural. He surely isn't used to this type of approach. Whereas Takahata is more objective and would have succeeded in making the character more credible. It was very unexpected of Miyazaki, and kind of hard to understand. Miyazaki usually does the opposite. He asks the audience to identify with Ashitaka's feelings, Chihiro's feelings, and Sophie's feelings towards Hayao. But this time, Miyazaki accepted the criticism of Takahata and said, I can do that too, and took on the challenge to depict his protagonist a bit more objectively. He tried to be more critical towards Jiro, so as to not get lost in his emotions. And he hired an amateur, Hideaki Anno, as his leading voice over actor. You might have thought that Miyazaki had gone mad, but that wasn't the case. The choice was deliberate. Anno read the script mechanically, making it hard for people to relate to the character emotionally. Miyazaki thought that people would automatically see his film from a different, more judgmental perspective. So this was Miyazaki and Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki's plan. Some people might have thought that Anno wasn't right for the character, and I also think it was a huge mistake. A professional actor would be more than sufficiently skilled to express Jiro's inner personality, but Miyazaki wanted to keep it secret. He wanted people to think about Jiro's inner thoughts and wonder, what is he thinking? Instead of having to explicitly show it. A good actor would have made the character more human. Miyazaki didn't want that. He wanted to avoid that. But interestingly, although Miyazaki hired an amateur, Hideaki Anno, as the protagonist, this plan breaks down as we approach the end of the film. What happens is that it gradually falls back to the pattern of the usual Miyazaki film. Since Anno was involved from the start, the more he recorded, the better he got. As Anno becomes better at acting, Jiro develops a deeper character. Miyazaki even admits that Anno becomes too good at the end. This was his miscalculation. I'll talk about it next week. So on the storyboard, it says girls working at a spinning mill. From the Meiji to the Taisho era, there were several of these spinning mills in Japan. Girls who had just graduated from elementary school were kidnapped from rural areas. They had to work in silk mills. You can read about them in The Tragic History of Factory Girls. The point is, they're all factory girls wearing worn-out clothes, meaning that they're all in his league. If you look closely, you won't see any upper-class girls. Not one. Not in this scene. Jiro is always looking for someone who is easily in his league, and when he finds one, he is always drawn to her. That's the way he is. Miyazaki intentionally brings in these factory girls. When you look at it carefully, you can see that Miyazaki created Jiro's character with extreme care. It's so interesting. These girls are still in middle school or high school, so they're the same age as Jiro, and they're screaming and waving at him. In response to that, he flies in a circle, and the shadow of the plane falls on the factory chimney. That means he's close to the factory, but the plane doesn't disturb the smoke at all. Miyazaki is very meticulous in the scene, so you would have expected the smoke to be affected when the plane nears the chimney, but in fact, it's completely unaffected. This means Jiro doesn't quite understand the mechanism of a plane at this point. Some of you might say, that's because it's a dream. But when Jiro flies low over the ground, the grass makes waves and everything looks very real. But this frame clearly shows that Jiro has never been on a real plane and shows the limits of his imagination. He may have a bakelite switch, but he doesn't know about runways. He can't even imagine the smoke being disturbed by the air current of the plane. So you can see that Jiro might be studious and wealthy. This is ultimately just a dream. But when he looks up, he senses something strange. There's something above the clouds. This is the frame. He's no longer a 13-year-old boy. He's older and very good-looking. This type of boy, who can often be seen in pre-war boys magazines in the Showa era, were all basically like this. All the characters are dressed like Jiro, and they're all good-looking or smiling. And Jiro in this frame looks just like them. In Jiro's mind, he's this good-looking guy from these boys' magazines. When he looks up, he sees an all-metal airship above the clouds. This is, by Jiro's imagination, a German Zeppelin airship. He probably knew that the Zeppelin was made of metal from some foreign magazine. If you look down here, there are lots of strange-looking bombs dangling from the aircraft. These are threatening to destroy the beautiful Japanese landscape and attack Jiro's pretty factory girls. Now, the concept of a huge metal airship has existed from as long ago as the second half of the 19th century. This is the magazine Popular Science, published in 1872. So scientists already had this concept of a metal airship 50 or 40 years before this period. When the airship comes close to attack the girls, Jiro courageously flies towards the airship to confront it. Next topic. What is the first wind that Jiro comes across? So far, I've only talked about the first 3 minutes of the film. Ready? Let's move on. Now, commentary number 3. Wow, sorry, it slipped out of my hand. So we've only covered the first 3 minutes of the film. This 13-year-old is still sleeping. Could you hand me that panel? We're still in his dream. Jiro sees a German airship looming over the clouds while he's on his plane, and he tries to attack it. He puts on a pair of goggles before he accelerates. But when he puts on the goggles, he suddenly goes blind. Something is wrong, and he's wondering, what is going on? Everything goes out of focus. And when he takes off his goggles, you see his glasses underneath. He wasn't wearing any glasses before, but these glasses suddenly appear. Like this. Jiro suddenly goes back to his younger self and realizes the bomb's falling from overhead, and then his plane plummets downwards. Jiro gets smaller and smaller as he falls downwards with his plane, and then he wakes up on his futon. This is, in fact, based on this. Winsor McKay's Little Nemo in Slumberland. This cartoon was serialized in an American newspaper. It always starts with Nemo's dream. There's an unexpected ending, and he eventually wakes up or falls out of his bed at the end. This is in fact like Miyazaki's final resolution. There's a line in this film, how would you spend the most creative decade of your life? When Miyazaki was in his 30s and 40s, which was the most creative period in his life, around the same age as Jiro when he was making his Zero fighter plane, he was trying to make an animation based on Little Nemo in Slumberland with Takahata in the US. But it didn't work out. All of Miyazaki's ideas were rejected, and Takahata was eventually fired. They were devastated when they came back to Japan, having lost all hope of ever making any animations again. They felt like they had wasted all their energy, skills, and passion for 2 years at the prime of their careers. So, a boy climbs up along the tiles of the roof and steps into his handmade plane, flies, confronts this gigantic metal airship, but ends up crashing. He has even forgotten that he normally wears glasses. He can't see anything, and so he crashes. That's when he wakes up. This is exactly the same structure as a Little Nemo episode. This was what Miyazaki wanted to make at the height of his career. That's why he included this sequence in the first scene of The Wind Rises. This is the culmination of his creative work. He knows that this is his last film, and he inserts this sequence from Little Nemo right at the opening and says, "See, this is what I always wanted to do, and I was right." That's where the story starts. I mean, I think he's a bit too tenacious. Jiro wakes up. He doesn't have his glasses on, so the ceiling is blurry. He can't see the light bulb or the mosquito net. He looks out on the yard, but he can't see the yard either. He takes his glasses that are lying on top of his clothes and puts them on. The lenses are really thick. It's then that he can finally see this beautiful yard. This view Jiro is looking at is what Miyazaki sees himself, because Miyazaki also wears thick glasses. Jiro blinks very slowly in this frame. He looks absolutely devastated. So this is the first wind that blows against him. In other words, his first adversity. He knows that he can never become a pilot. Girls will never look at him with that longing gaze. How we see people with glasses now and how people saw them back then is completely different. It was the age of militarism. Japan was imbued with militarism. So men with glasses were labeled as a failure. He goes to school after this scene, but nobody but him is wearing glasses. Also, the teacher Jiro likes is the only teacher wearing glasses. None of the other teachers are wearing glasses. So back then, a person wearing glasses was considered a loser. But nothing has really changed since then. Today, when Miyazaki talks about Takahata, he says, Takahata was very popular with the girls. Whereas Takahata says, Miyazaki was never popular. Look at him. He sounds so delighted when he says that. This is actually true. So Miyazaki understands Jiro's feelings. No matter how much he loves planes, he can never become a pilot. That's because he was born with poor eyesight. This makes him despair. That's what we see in this frame. Like I said, it's the age of militarism. Boys wearing glasses were generally labeled as failures by adults and also by girls. Girls were not interested in boys who didn't qualify to become a soldier. There's a scene where Jiro passes pretty girls, but they don't so much as glance at him. Jiro Horikoshi's first setback: I have poor eyesight. After this, he goes to school. He shakes off his negative thoughts and goes to school. You see here a light railway. A light railway has a very simple structure. The mame train, literally meaning bean train, is running on the track. This is a simple train, a lot more simple than Thomas from Thomas and Friends. And as time moves on, the trains in this film evolve. The passage of time or changes in society are often expressed through vehicles in this film. In the beginning, Miyazaki shows this simple train that was running near his childhood home in 1916. Later, he gets on a train to go to Tokyo University. The big earthquake hits Tokyo, and then he goes to Germany. As the trains evolve, you can see how the world continues to develop and how Japan is being left behind. You can see that everyone crossing the railroad track, except for the students, look like they're still in the Edo era. This was an interesting time when traditional culture and modern culture coexisted. After Jiro crosses the railroad track, please look at the top image. He crosses a bridge, and on his right side, you see a brick building and a wooden building. This is the dorm of those girls from the spinning mill in his dream. The girls were probably sold to this factory after graduating from elementary school, so they're the same age as Jiro. When you look at the handrails of this bridge, you'll notice that it's the same bridge that we saw in Jiro's dream. See the picture at the bottom? So, although his dream seemed like the product of a creative imagination, he's secretly just longing to be more popular locally. He wants the girls to like him and he wants to show off his plane. He's a boy with this small, simple dream. Miyazaki draws a nameplate on the bridge to show it's the same bridge. But it's too small, and even I only noticed this after 3 or 4 views. This is the street in front of the elementary school. The western building in the back is the elementary school. And you see lots of store signs, which are symbols of capitalism. Also, people are wearing kimonos from the Edo period. But you also see some people delivering milk, which is a modern drink. So, 2 different worlds coexist. So, Jiro goes to school, and his kind teacher lends him a foreign aviation magazine. This one here. Let's take a look at their behavior. A teacher comes in the door. He doesn't wear glasses. He's tall and masculine. Whereas the teacher next to Jiro is wearing glasses and he's very short. You can look at this scene again if you recorded the film. Or the official Ghibli DVD. This tall teacher comes boldly in the door when he enters the teacher's room. But the teacher with glasses steps aside, and as you can see, he even bows slightly to the other teacher. But the tall teacher doesn't bow back. He ignores the guy completely. This was how it was like back in those days. People wearing glasses were considered to be of low status. You'd all be surprised at how they were treated. I mean, they're both teachers, but this guy with glasses steps aside and bows, whereas the other guy just walks right in. Why is there such a difference in their behavior? It's almost like a class system, like the difference between the popular group at school and the nerds. Maybe that explains it. Back then, people judged men by their appearance and physique, and by whether they wore glasses or not. This was young Miyazaki's world. Looking at Miyazaki's works, people usually assume that Miyazaki loved to play outdoors when he was a child. But one of his brothers said in an interview, No, he was one of those non-sporty kids that stayed at home drawing all day. So his films surprised me. I certainly don't remember him playing in the mountains. So Miyazaki was more like this short guy wearing glasses. He couldn't be part of the popular group. You can see in this scene that they already had female teachers in this period. You can see a female teacher along with some other teachers in the background, but you don't see any of them wearing glasses. Not one. Because school teachers had to be respected by the students. So that's why it was very rare for a teacher to wear glasses. Maybe there were actually more people wearing glasses, but not many. Although you do see many people wearing glasses in period dramas on NHK, people who wore glasses were considered weak. So when Jiro is walking home from school, he sees a kid being bullied. They're bullying this kid from the lower grade, trying to push him into the river. Jiro tries to go after them and yells, "Stop!" But he trips. Jiro has this strong sense of justice, but he's not very athletic. You'll notice that in other scenes as well. He reacts quickly and tries to go after them, but he trips. Later in the film, on the train, Jiro's hat gets blown away, and when Nahoko catches it, she almost falls off the train. And you probably thought that Jiro saved her from falling. But look at that scene again. Jiro's hand is not even close to reaching her. Her housemaid rescued her. He slowly withdraws his hand after trying to save her. He's like, "Here, grab my hand." Oops. He's too slow. Anyway, Jiro obviously has a strong sense of justice, but he's not the athletic type. We tend to alter the story to suit our expectations. We tend to think that Nahoko remembered Jiro because he saved her, but that's not true. His hand doesn't reach her. Miyazaki portrays Jiro in quite a harsh light in this scene. And this is Miyazaki's objectivism, which is also his response to Takahata. So, Jiro goes up to the boys. They mumble something which doesn't make sense, and they all have this typical villain look. And you'll notice that none of them are wearing glasses. Jiro tells them it is wrong to bully younger kids, which is absolutely true. But when you look at these boys, in this other frame, they look completely normal. They don't look so malicious. But as soon as you look at them from Jiro's point of view, they turn into villains. Basically, this is how they look to Jiro, as villains. Also, the boys' response doesn't make any sense. In the storyboard, it says, make them speak gibberish. So they go, "Weh, owae, jamete." The same thing happens during meetings with the Navy and Army officials and the hot tots of some company. It's hard to explain, but audience members who expect a feel-good animation tend to interpret this as Jiro being this strong-willed character who can tune out this sort of meaningless babble. But that's not what Miyazaki intended. In that case, he would have written the lines more clearly, like the generals in Laputa. Jiro considers these people who look down on him to be less than human. That is what Miyazaki is trying to say. Their words are impossible to understand, and there's no need to understand them. This is also because of his sense of justice. Because of his strong sense of justice, he is very quick to block people like that out. As soon as he judges that someone is not worth dealing with, he completely turns his back on them. He doesn't listen to them. He doesn't want to interact with them. So what they say means nothing to him. See, their faces turn villainous only when they are seen from Jiro's point of view. That means that they look like villains when seen through Jiro's lenses. Jiro's a bit condescending. And this attitude of his doesn't change till the very end of his life. Miyazaki even admits that. According to Miyazaki, during the last days of Jiro's life, he had a bad reputation as a professor. He had a weak voice, and students couldn't hear him. When the first commercial aircraft, YS-11, was developed, he was asked to be in charge of the tail. And according to the team, Jiro only ever talked about his Zero fighter planes. He was obsessed with the past and never developed anything new. Matao Sanuki, an aeronautical engineer, who was also a great aeronautical journalist, talks about Jiro's last years in an article. Jiro was a bit too snobbish and never talked about himself. He never listened to other people's advice. People all over the world praised him as a genius who had once played an essential part in the aviation industry. But as time passed, he became a lonely old man and turned his back on the world. That's how I see it. Jiro has a strong sense of justice, and he is honest, and he is easy for us to relate to. But at the same time, he has this different side as well. Miyazaki chose this complex character as his last protagonist. But as I said, he wasn't a bad boy at all. After all, he confronts the bullies. After Jiro plays this one-arm shoulder throw trick on one of the boys, he gets badly beaten. And when he's asked by his mother what happened, he just says, "I fell." He doesn't tell her that he was in a fight. He doesn't complain that he lost the fight. He has a strong will to take action, but he doesn't talk much. So he goes home. He tells his mother that he fell, and his mother just says, "Eat your snack." His little sister Kayo is playing in the yard. Kayo comes up to him and says, "Play with me, you promised." But he ignores her. The babysitter, she is the same age as Jiro. She has to look after his sister. She's a girl from the country living with this family as a housekeeper. "Welcome home, Jiro," she says, but Jiro doesn't answer. When this film was released, I talked about why Jiro is so rude to his own sister. Because he usually helps girls in trouble. Even when he was busy designing planes, he would say something like, "Would you like some sweets?" But he was always cold and never kind to his own little sister. He's impolite to his servants as well. When you look at all the previous Ghibli films, whenever a servant says, "Welcome home," the master would always say something back. But in this film, Jiro ignores her. This attitude is very similar to Cagliostro in The Castle of Cagliostro. He dehumanizes the servants. He completely shuts out people he considers worthless. Jiro doesn't mind sacrificing Japanese citizens for his dream. So I personally call Jiro Horikoshi the young Cagliostro. The Castle of Cagliostro is Miyazaki's first film, and 34 years after, he creates a new version of Cagliostro to portray the other side of Count Cagliostro. Cagliostro is so attractive as a villain because Miyazaki's personal feelings are reflected everywhere in his speeches. This time, he tried casting Cagliostro as the protagonist. You would never have imagined that Cagliostro is the protagonist here. 6 years ago, when this film was released, we weren't ready for this. But now I guess we are more trained and ready to accept this type of story. Kayo keeps saying, "But you promised, brother." But Jiro never looks at her. Not even once. He's reading the magazine he got from his teacher. In it, you see the Italian aircraft designer, Count Gianni Caproni. Count means that he is a landowner. Jiro finds an article about him. That night, Jiro has a life-changing encounter. I have to end the free part now because it's already been 55 minutes. So, Jiro finds Caproni's article. Now, it's still only the first 7 minutes of the film, but you can already see that The Wind Rises is very different from all the other Ghibli films. So, please watch it again from a different perspective. It is not subjective. The protagonist is depicted from an objective point of view to keep the audience at a distance. I mean, this protagonist is not even one of Miyazaki's alter egos. He's not an ideal character either. He's depicted as a cold guy who only shows interest in girls who are in his league. So it is very raw in a way. He takes it for granted that he's born into a rich family and abuses that privilege. That's why he's so cold towards his sister and the servant. But on the other hand, he can be very kind to the disadvantaged. And he feels inferior to the others because of his poor eyesight. But he's an honest guy with a strong sense of justice. As you can see, Miyazaki has never created a character as complex as this one. This is something completely new for him. Although, in a way, you could say that Jiro is a bit similar to Seita in Grave of the Fireflies. The protagonist Jiro dreams about, Caproni, that night. What does Caproni say to him? If you look at the storyboard, it says an extreme close-up of Caproni that shows his madness, like Mephistopheles. This is a note that Miyazaki wrote in the storyboard, so it's his direction. I'd like to talk about it more in the next limited part. Now the questionnaire. I'm sorry, I couldn't go further than the first 7 minutes of the film, but you must understand this much in order to understand the theme, which we'll talk about next week. I have to go step by step and show you each piece of evidence. Otherwise, it gets too hard to explain. Comment just said, there's no special questionnaire this time? No, we don't need that this week. How about you guys at the back? You want to do it? Okay then, I'll think about it next week. Let's see the result. I see you guys like that special questionnaire. Thank you very much. I guess I was a bit slow this time. The Wind Rises will continue till next week. Next week we'll talk about the hidden theme of The Wind Rises and the three devils that tempt Jiro. Okay, let's switch to the limited part.
Thank you for watching until the end. I am the most famous Otaku King in Japan, Otaking Toshio Okada. I started planning to talk overseas about animations and movies popular in Japan in English. Before long, I'm planning to add English subtitles to movie talking in Japanese, so please look forward to it. If you ask a question in this comment field of this video, maybe I will talk about comments as a theme. We welcome the people who are interested in the forefront of Japanese otaku culture, and those who want to hear stories of interesting animations and movies. So please subscribe our channel. If there is good relation, I will get better and I will do my best. Thanks.